An F-15 is down. Peace talks collapsed this morning in Pakistan. The ceasefire expires in 10 days. And now, U.S. intelligence has confirmed that China is preparing to deliver advanced air defense systems to Iran within the next few weeks. Systems specifically designed to counter American aircraft, routed through third countries to hide the supply chain. This is happening right now, during the ceasefire, from the same country that publicly claimed to have helped broker it. Trump's response when asked about it on camera: China will have big problems. No specifics, no timeline, no consequence, just a sentence. Meanwhile, 3 intelligence sources are telling CNN the weapons are already in transit. The Middle East just entered a completely new phase, and most people have no idea how bad the economic fallout from this could get. According to 3 people familiar with recent U.S. intelligence assessments, China is preparing to deliver new air defense systems to Iran within the next few weeks. CNN broke this story first. Bloomberg confirmed it. The Washington Examiner followed with additional detail. The systems being transferred are shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles known as MANPADs, short for Man Portable Air Defense Systems. 1 soldier, 1 shoulder, 1 missile, heat-seeking guidance. Extremely difficult to detect before launch because there is no radar signature, nothing that U.S. electronic countermeasures can identify in advance. Here is why this matters so much right now. Trump confirmed at a press conference that the F-15 that went down over Iran last week was hit by, in his words, a handheld shoulder missile, a heat-seeking missile. The exact same category of system China is now preparing to deliver. Iran used it to bring down a U.S. F-15E, the first American combat aircraft lost in Iranian airspace since the conflict began. 2. Black Hawk helicopters were also struck during the rescue operation that followed, both flying deep inside Iranian territory. China is shipping more of the precise system that already proved capable of neutralizing American air assets in this conflict, and 2 intelligence sources told CNN that Beijing is routing these shipments through intermediary countries specifically to conceal the true origin. You do not build that kind of logistics arrangement if nothing is being sent. What makes this development so significant is the gap between what China is saying publicly and what it is doing privately. That gap is enormous, and every indication is that it is completely deliberate. On the public stage, Beijing positioned itself as a stabilizing force. A Chinese embassy spokesperson told CNN this week that Beijing had been working to help bring about a ceasefire, an end to the conflict. That statement won China diplomatic goodwill across the developing world. It positioned Beijing as the responsible party in the room. That image carries real strategic value internationally. Behind closed doors, weapons deliveries are being arranged through third countries to reach Iran before the ceasefire expires. A U.S. intelligence source explained Beijing's logic to CNN. China has no interest in directly entering this conflict on Iran's side. A direct confrontation with the U.S. and Israel would be unwinnable. So instead, Beijing runs a 2-track operation: diplomatic mediator on camera, defense supplier off camera. If the ceasefire collapses and active operations resume, Iran goes back in with stronger air defenses than it had going into the truce. U.S. aircraft face greater risk. China maintains plausible deniability the entire time. The timing is sharp. Trump is scheduled to visit China for a summit with Xi Jinping early next month. Beijing is arranging weapon deliveries right before that meeting. The message Beijing is sending is clear. It calculates that it holds enough leverage, economically, diplomatically, and strategically, that Washington cannot afford to derail a presidential summit over this. China is essentially betting that Trump will issue a strong statement and then show up in Beijing anyway. The Chinese embassy denied the entire report, calling it untrue and urging the U.S. to stop maliciously drawing connections. That denial is less significant than the specific logistics operations that 2 intelligence sources described in detail to CNN. This is not the first layer of Chinese support in this conflict. Chinese companies have been selling Iran-sanctioned dual-use technology throughout the entire campaign. Equipment that helps Tehran continue building weapon systems and improve navigation capabilities. What is different now is that direct government transfers of defensive weapon systems mark a fundamentally new level of involvement, one that changes the strategic picture for whatever comes after the ceasefire. China is not the only major power running a quiet support operation for Iran in this conflict. Russia has been doing it throughout the entire campaign, and in a dimension that has proven extremely costly for the U.S. side. Western intelligence sources confirmed to CNN that Russia was feeding Iran real-time battlefield intelligence during active operations, specifically the precise locations of U.S. naval assets and aircraft across the Gulf. In modern conflict, knowing exactly where the adversary's assets are positioned is the decisive edge. Russia was providing those coordinates to Tehran throughout the fighting. Russia also helped Iran adapt tactics developed in its own conflict in Ukraine, techniques refined against infrastructure targets, now shared with Tehran for use against U.S. military assets in the Gulf. Putin denied this to Trump directly by phone. Multiple senior U.S. officials who spoke to the Washington Post gave a different account. Russia supplies the intelligence layer. China supplies the hardware layer. Iran operates inside both. Despite 13,000 missions and 12,300 targets struck, the U.S. emerged from 5 weeks without a decisive strategic outcome. Iran is still standing, its government is still functioning, and it is using the ceasefire to rearm. The truce itself is failing. Peace talks between the U.S. and Iran in Islamabad concluded today with no agreement. Both delegations left blaming the other. Vice President Vance said the core issue was Iran's refusal to commit to abandoning its nuclear program. Iran said the U.S. was making excessive demands and negotiating in bad faith. Their foreign minister stated publicly that Tehran's trust in American diplomatic commitments is at zero. The ceasefire expires April 22nd. That is 10 days from today. There is no framework, no draft agreement, and no credible path toward one. The U.S. weapons picture makes this even more serious. The Pentagon committed a substantial portion of its JASM long-range cruise missile inventory to this campaign. Those are now being relocated from Pacific stockpiles, the reserves designated for contingencies involving U.S. allies in Asia, to Middle East facilities. When that transfer completes, the stockpile drops from 2,300 missiles to just 425. America's Asian partners are being stripped of their designated reserves to sustain a conflict that produced no decisive result. Iran, in the same window, absorbs Chinese air defense upgrades. The equation going into any resumed operations has shifted clearly in one direction. For decades, American strategic credibility in the Middle East rested on one foundation: the ability to project air power over adversary territory with near total freedom. The Gulf conflict in 1991 established that template so decisively it became the foundation of regional deterrence for an entire generation. That template is now being seriously challenged. Iran demonstrated during 5 weeks of operations that portable shoulder-fired systems could neutralize U.S. aircraft. An F-15E and 2 Black Hawks went down in a single day. Video emerged showing Iranian police officers, not specialized military units, firing at American helicopters with portable shoulder weapons near the town of Charam. Police officers. That footage communicates something specific about how widely accessible this capability has become inside Iran. Now add Chinese air defense systems to that existing baseline. Give Iran an upgraded network of portable systems that can be dispersed, moved, and operated without radar emissions that electronic countermeasures can detect. The risk calculation for air operations over Iranian territory shifts substantially. The Gulf states are paying close attention to all of this. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait. All of them built their security architecture around the assumption that the U.S. could dominate any situation in the region on short notice. That assumption is being re-examined right now. A UN economic study projects the conflict will cost Gulf economies $200 billion in lost growth. GDP contractions range from 5.2% to 8.5% across the region. Dubai's tourism has effectively collapsed. Qatar's energy infrastructure faces years of repair. Saudi Arabia's oil revenue evaporated while production facilities absorb damage. These governments are furious and short on cash, and they hold $8 trillion in investments, the majority in dollar instruments. Before this conflict, Gulf states bought $47 billion in U.S. bonds just in 2025. That buying demand may not come back for years. The dollar is already feeling this. During the peak of the conflict, the S&P 500 fell nearly 6%. Chinese assets on the Hang Seng fell only 3%. Investors in China lost half as much. Fund managers, central banks, and sovereign wealth funds are noting that comparison and acting on it. Since February, Treasury holdings at the New York Federal Reserve dropped by $82 billion to $2.7 trillion. Central banks are cutting dollar exposure. Deutsche Bank issued panda bonds this year, raising 8.6 billion RMB at 1.6 times oversubscription. More investors wanted those bonds than were available. First EU bank panda bond issuance of 2026. It will not be the last. The financial impact that most directly affects ordinary Americans is landing at the gas station and at the grocery store, and neither number is moving in a favorable direction. U.S. crude has risen to $112 per barrel. That is a 70% increase from pre-conflict levels. Gasoline crossed $4 per gallon for the first time in 4 years. Diesel is above $5.50 per gallon, back at the same levels seen during the peak of the Ukraine conflict. Every day, Americans are paying $240 million more in fuel costs than before this situation began. The cumulative total has already reached $8.4 billion pulled directly out of household budgets. These are still early numbers. February CPI came in at 2.4%, and that reading predates the full energy shock working through the supply chain. When diesel prices spike this hard, every product that moves on a truck gets more expensive. That covers essentially the entire U.S. retail economy. J.P. Morgan ran the projections. If oil holds above $100 per barrel, inflation rises by 2 full percentage points. That translates to a 1.25% contraction in U.S. GDP. Add a 15% equity market decline, well within the range of current risk, and the combined impact approaches 3%. That is recession territory. The Federal Reserve is now being priced with a 40% probability of raising rates this year. The funds rate could end 2026 at 3.75%. That reprices borrowing costs across the entire economy at the worst possible moment for consumers and businesses already under pressure. The bond market is flashing warning signs as well. The U.S. 10-year Treasury yield reached 4.41% during recent trading, approaching the level that previously triggered a full policy reversal. When yields broke above 4.6% earlier this year during the trade conflict, equity markets fell 15 to 20%, and the administration reversed course within days. The same ceiling is approaching again, and this time the underlying fiscal situation is worse. The U.S. deficit is on track to exceed $2 trillion this fiscal year. Military operations in the Gulf region cost approximately $50 million per day just to maintain. The Pentagon is seeking $200 billion in supplemental appropriations to sustain the effort. Every dollar of that adds to the national debt and requires a buyer. And the buyer pool is shrinking as central banks globally reduce dollar exposure and Gulf states redirect cash toward domestic recovery rather than U.S. bond purchases. The variable most observers have not fully priced in yet is Japan, and the situation there is deteriorating in real time. The yen recently cracked 160 to the dollar. Japan's finance minister has publicly warned that decisive action is coming. Japan holds $1.2 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds, $45 billion more than just 6 months ago. It is one of the largest foreign holders of American debt in the world. Japan cannot raise domestic interest rates without triggering a debt implosion of its own. Interest payments are projected to reach 41 trillion yen by 2029, consuming 30% of the total national budget even at current rates. Japanese industry is being squeezed between energy costs that keep rising and a currency that keeps weakening, making those energy imports even more expensive in yen terms. If Tokyo decides to mobilize a portion of its treasury holdings to defend the yen or subsidize domestic energy costs, U.S. bond prices drop, yields spike higher, and every financial pressure Washington is already managing gets significantly worse at the same moment. The last time Japan intervened in currency markets, it deployed nearly $100 billion in asset sales. A comparable action now, in this environment, would send shockwaves through the U.S. financial system. The 10-year yield at 4.41% is already near the threshold that forced previous reversals. Japanese selling pushes it higher. On the broader de-dollarization front, the BRICS New Development Bank is actively switching its loan book from dollars to yuan. The practical reason is straightforward. China's 10-year bond yield is 1.8%. The U.S. equivalent is above 4.3%. For a developing economy borrowing $1 billion over 10 years for infrastructure, that difference translates to hundreds of millions in savings over the life of the loan. Countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America are doing that math and reaching obvious conclusions. China has over 40 bilateral currency swap agreements covering 4.1 trillion RMB, approximately $580 billion. Countries facing financial stress can access Chinese currency through those lines rather than scrambling for dollars. Getting a US dollar swap line, by contrast, requires being a close US ally, typically part of the G7, and meeting political conditions that come with their own costs. The dollar's share of global central bank reserves has fallen to 56.8%, a 31-year low. The trajectory is downward. De-dollarization started slowly, but momentum is building with every new conflict and every new sanctions threat the U.S. makes. Step back from the individual data points and a consistent pattern becomes visible. China is not simply transferring equipment to one country. Beijing is methodically weakening the infrastructure of American global influence across multiple dimensions simultaneously, in a way designed to leave no single action large enough to force a direct confrontation. On the strategic side, Chinese companies supplied dual-use technology throughout the conflict. Russia supplied intelligence. Now, direct transfers of defensive systems are beginning. Layer by layer, Iran's capability is being rebuilt during the ceasefire window, specifically to change the outcome if operations resume. On the financial side, panda bonds absorb capital leaving U.S. markets. The yuan gains strength. Oil purchases in yuan push de-dollarization through the Gulf. The dollar's reserve share sits at a 31-year low and keeps declining. On the diplomatic side, Beijing brokered the ceasefire and positioned itself internationally as the responsible mediator. Washington conducted 5 weeks of operations and emerged without a clear strategic victory. The world's perception of who helped is already set. This leaves Washington facing a decision set with no clean options. If the administration accepts a negotiated outcome that leaves Iran standing, better equipped with Chinese systems, and without a binding nuclear commitment, it signals to every U.S. partner in the region that the security guarantee has real limits. Gulf states recalibrate their foreign policy. Treasury demand from the region craters. If the administration chooses to escalate or deploy ground forces, Iran's likely response would include closing Hormuz entirely and coordinating with forces in Yemen across the Red Sea. 20 million barrels of daily global oil supply would disappear. Oil moves toward $150 or $200 per barrel. Japan hits intervention thresholds immediately. U.S. consumers face an inflation shock no monetary policy can absorb fast enough. Equity markets head toward recession territory. And with Chinese air defense systems now arriving in Iran, the risk environment for air operations over Iranian territory has changed substantially. Trump's warning to China, big problems, sits in this context for what it is: a statement made for domestic audiences with no visible enforcement mechanism behind it. China has already absorbed a full trade conflict. It is managing the peace diplomacy. It holds over $1 trillion in U.S. debt as a financial counterweight. And it is arranging weapons deliveries to a U.S. adversary, while the U.S. president prepares to fly to Beijing for a summit. The ceasefire expires in 10 days. Peace talks just collapsed. Weapons are in transit. The dollar's reserve status is eroding. And China is playing the strategic long game while Washington manages the next news cycle. Tell us what you think in the comments below. Will this Chinese weapons delivery collapse the ceasefire before it even expires? And is American dominance in the Middle East genuinely finished? Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these historic times.